Buenas tardes. El Colegio de México y el Fondo Patrimonial en beneficio del Colegio de México, Fundación Colmex, les dan la más cordial bienvenida a la ceremonia de la 7ª entrega del Premio Daniel Cosío Villegas en Ciencias Sociales 2022, otorgado al Dr. James A. Robinson, reconocido politólogo y economista británico, considerado como uno de los destacados especialistas en los campos de la economía, la ciencia política y la historia económica, distinguido por sus notables logros y contribuciones al estudio y reflexión sobre los procesos del desarrollo comparado en el largo plazo, en particular en los países latinoamericanos. Es un honor contar con la presencia en el presidium de la doctora Silvia Elena Yorguli Saucedo, presidenta del Colegio de México. Del galardonado, Dr. James A. Robinson, director del Instituto Pearson para el Estudio y Resolución de Conflictos Globales de la Escuela Harris de Política Pública de la Universidad de Chicago. Del Dr. Ulises Beltrán, presidente de la Asamblea General del Fondo Patrimonial en beneficio del Colegio de México, Fundación Colmex, y de la doctora Aurora Gómez-Galvarratio, profesora investigadora del Centro de Estudios Históricos del Colegio de México, y del doctor Ángel Calderón, profesor investigador del Centro de Estudios Económicos de esta institución, a quienes agradecemos la gentileza de su compañía para la celebración de este evento. Para dar inicio a nuestra ceremonia, invitamos a la doctora Yorguli, presidenta del Colegio de México, a dirigir a la audiencia su mensaje de bienvenida.
Bueno, buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Pues es un gusto estar aquí en esta ceremonia de la entrega del Premio Daniel Cosío Villegas en Ciencias Sociales 2022, que se otorga en esta ocasión al doctor James Robinson. Por supuesto que nos da mucho gusto darle la bienvenida al doctor Robinson aquí al Colegio de México en esta 7ª edición del premio. Además, bueno, un gusto tras la pandemia tenerla ya otra vez de vuelta en el auditorio Alfonso Reyes. También me da mucho gusto saludar al doctor Ulises Beltrán, presidente de la Asamblea General del Patronato de Fundación, quien fue recientemente nombrado presidente y de hecho nos acompaña por primera vez en un acto ya en estas funciones. Entonces, bueno, pues bienvenido Ulises al Colegio de México. También, bueno, quiero darle la bienvenida y agradecerles a Aurora Gómez-Galvarratio del Centro de Estudios Históricos y Ángel Calderón del Centro de Estudios Económicos, que aceptaron acompañarnos en esta ceremonia, pues para resaltar el engarce, la sinergia y las muchas razones por las que se decidió otorgarle este premio al doctor Robinson. También, bueno, me da mucho gusto ver que nos acompañan estudiantes, profesores de diversos centros, que refleja parte del espíritu de la entrega de este premio, voy a mencionarlo un poco más adelante, y darle la bienvenida a Ofelia Anguo, secretaria que nos visita por primera vez en su calidad de secretaria de Educación, Ciencia, Tecnología e Innovación en la Ciudad de México. Bienvenida a quienes nos acompañan de embajadas, del Banco de México, otros miembros del patronato. Bueno, pues sean todos bienvenidos al Colegio de México y también un saludo a quienes nos acompañan de manera virtual en esta transmisión en vivo. El Premio Daniel Cosío Villegas en Ciencias Sociales surge en 2010, de la mano también del Premio Alfonso Reyes en Humanidades, ambos a iniciativa del Colegio de México y de la Fundación Colmex, con el objeto de conmemorar los 70 años que cumplía la institución en ese año, y con la idea de crear un galardón centrado en reconocer tanto a personas como instituciones destacadas en el ámbito de las ciencias sociales, para el caso del Premio Daniel Cosío Villegas, y en Humanidades, para el caso del Premio Alfonso Reyes. Y bueno, creo que el premio en este tiempo ha cumplido su objetivo no solamente en términos del reconocimiento que se ha dado a quienes lo han recibido, sino que también el objetivo de crear un puente entre integrantes de la comunidad académica del colegio, estudiantado y profesores, y aquellos que han sido distinguidos con estos premios. Nada más para recordar, en su primera emisión se entregó a Mario Molina en 2010, Premio Nobel de Química, en 2012 a Pablo González Casanova, además egresado del Centro de Estudios Sociológicos, en 2014 al Fondo de Cultura Económica, pues institución hermana que comparte ese origen ligado al nombre justamente de don Daniel Cosío Villegas. En 2016, Carmen Miró, demógrafa que participó en la formación institucional del campo aquí en México y en América Latina. En 2018, Alain Rouquier, politólogo experto también en temas de América Latina. En 2020 a Rita Segato, socióloga argentina y bueno, un referente obligado en los estudios de género en la región. Y bueno, en este año 2022 el comité dictaminador del premio, después de la deliberación, decidió otorgar al doctor James Robinson, reconocido politólogo y economista británico, uno de los más destacados especialistas en los campos de la economía, la ciencia política y la historia económica, el premio. Debo decir que es el primer economista en recibir el premio y quisiera en esta breve introducción resaltar algunos de los elementos o por qué creo que también es un motivo de celebración ahora entregar el premio a un economista y hablar un poquito de la economía en el Colegio de México, aunque Ángel lo podrá hacer con mayor detalle, y don Daniel Cosío Villegas. Cuando uno revisa la historia de don Daniel Cosío Villegas, en una época en que no existía la economía como un campo en México, desde sus orígenes, desde su formación en la UNAM, en ese caso en Derecho, mostró un interés por ir avanzando a lo largo de sus estudios en formalizar y concretar este campo, el campo de la economía, primero en la UNAM, con una visión en la formación de expertos en el área en México, que tuvieran además acceso al conocimiento o a la discusión económica en español, lo cual lo vincula también con la historia que después tendría el Fondo de Cultura Económica en la traducción de clásicos al español. Y bueno, no solo en español, sino también con un compromiso y una iniciativa de difusión del conocimiento en el campo de la economía que transminó a América Latina. Siendo don Silvio Zavala presidente de la institución y con el acompañamiento de don Víctor Urquidi, se crea en el colegio un centro de estudios en 1964 y se abre la docencia en economía y una agenda de investigación en este campo. Ya son casi 60 años, el año que entra celebraremos los 60 años de investigación económica y formación de destacados y destacadas egresados que hoy podemos encontrar en organismos internacionales, en gobiernos nacionales de México y de otros países y académicos que continúan desde diversas instituciones de América Latina y de nuestro país formando a nuevas generaciones y dinamizando la agenda de investigación económica. Pero hay ciertas particularidades en este trabajo que hizo don Daniel Cosío Villegas desde sus años de formación y más tarde como un formador de instituciones, y es una idea de la economía con una visión amplia, con un diálogo interdisciplinario, cercano a la historia, ¿no? Por la propia orientación de don Daniel Cosío Villegas, pero también por cómo este entendimiento de los procesos económicos con una perspectiva histórica, pues también agregaba, aparte de lo que sería el sello de la investigación en el Colegio de México, y que vemos claramente legado en la línea sobre historia económica en el Centro de Estudios Históricos, y bueno, Aurora es parte justamente de ese grupo. En esta formación del campo de la economía en América Latina, pues han sido centrales temas que son recurrentes desde los 60, pero en mi época de estudiante y que siguen al día de hoy, como son los dilemas del desarrollo, del crecimiento económico, de la reducción de la pobreza, de la reducción de la desigualdad, que es uno de los temas también transversales en la agenda de investigación en el colegio, y que también pues se han visto reflejados en esta perspectiva de tomarlos desde un diálogo inter y multidisciplinario. En ese sentido, el trabajo del doctor Robinson podría estar relacionado con líneas de investigación de varios de los centros, del Centro de Estudios Históricos, por supuesto, del Centro de Estudios Económicos, pero también del Centro de Estudios Internacionales por su carácter de investigación en ciencia política, del Centro de Estudios Sociológicos, del Centro de Estudios Demográficos, Urbanos y Ambientales, ya mencioné al menos 5 de los 8 centros de estudio, y bueno, pues esa es parte, creo, de los elementos que tomó en consideración el jurado en la deliberación. Entonces, bueno, ya aterrizando en este premio al doctor Robinson, creo que es una forma de celebrar esta sinergia. Tiene una trayectoria notable en investigación sobre el desarrollo comparado en el largo plazo, siendo actualmente uno de los autores más citados en el campo de la economía, la ciencia política y la historia económica. Y voy a retomar algo que comentamos con el doctor Marichal. El doctor Robinson es promotor del campo de estudios institucionales del desarrollo económico de distintas naciones, pero refuerza sus trabajos con investigaciones cliométricas que le otorgan profundidad histórica y permiten explorar por qué algunas sociedades y economías han disfrutado de mejor o peor desempeño en un tiempo largo. Por estas razones, por su enfoque interdisciplinario, por las temáticas que trabaja, por su interés en América Latina, por los estudios comparativos que ha desarrollado, entre ellos comparando México, Nogales con México, Arizona, pero también de otras regiones, inclusive trabajos sobre África en épocas más recientes, celebramos estas coincidencias. También por su interés en generar materiales de difusión del conocimiento que no solo se manejen entre los expertos o un lenguaje más técnico, sino que llegue de manera más amplia. Y por supuesto esta visión interdisciplinaria que se ve muy bien reflejada en lo que es pues, una de sus obras icónicas, Why Nations Fail, The Origins of Power, Prosperity and Poverty, que ha sido traducido a 41 lenguas desde su publicación en 2012 y que es un libro de referencia para economistas, expertos en ciencia política e historiadores. Es un interlocutor relevante para entender lo que ocurre en nuestra región y por eso también es un gusto tenerlo aquí. Quisiera también mencionar que James Robinson no es ajeno a las actividades de docencia en el colegio. Las aportaciones del doctor Robinson son lectura obligada sobre economía institucional. Por ejemplo, en los cursos de desarrollo se incluyen publicaciones como, además de Why Nations Fails, The Colonial Origins of Comparative Development and Empirical Investigation, Why Did the West Extend the Franchise, Democracy, Inequality and Growth in Historical Perspective, entre otras de sus obras. De hecho, en un libro que está ahora en proceso de publicación en el colegio, un libro que pensamos que será apoyo para la docencia justamente en temas de economía y cambio climático, de autoría del doctor Yunes, uno de los capítulos del libro sobre desarrollo sustentable y cambio climático se inspira en el modelo de Robinson y de Acemoglu expuesto en el trabajo Persistence of Power, Elites and Institutions. Lo doy como algunos ejemplos de esa vinculación y por qué la visita de James Robinson no nos es ajena en el colegio. Cierro diciendo, bueno, creo que ya quedó expresado, hay muchas razones para celebrar el otorgamiento del Premio Daniel Cosío Villegas al profesor Robinson, su obra, sus aportaciones. Es un gusto tenerlo aquí en el Colegio de México, en reuniones con el claustro académico y también con el estudiantado. Y bueno, pues es un motivo de celebración su visita, que reciba este premio Daniel Cosío Villegas. Bienvenido y mis felicitaciones por este merecido galardón. Muchas gracias.
A continuación, escucharemos el mensaje del doctor Ulises Beltrán, presidente de la Asamblea General del Fondo Patrimonial en beneficio del Colegio de México, Fundación Colmex.
No, seré muy breve. Primero, es un honor dar para la Fundación poder otorgar este premio, este reconocimiento. Es realmente la misión de la Fundación es precisamente fomentar la excelencia académica, tratar de ayudar a la excelencia académica que caracteriza a esta institución y pues simplemente felicitarlo y felicitarnos por haber otorgado este premio y haberlo podido financiar. Personalmente me da mucho gusto ser egresado del Centro de Estudios Históricos de esta institución. Gracias.
Gracias, doctor Beltrán. Daremos paso a la entrega del Premio Villegas en Ciencias Sociales 2022 al doctor James A. Robinson, quien lo recibe de manos de la presidenta del Colegio de México, doctora Silvia Yorguli, y del doctor Ulises Beltrán, presidente de la Asamblea General de Fundación Colmex. Procederemos a la lectura del diploma.
El Colegio de México y la Fundación Colmex otorgan el Premio Daniel Cosío Villegas en Ciencias Sociales 2022 a James A. Robinson, reconocido politólogo y economista británico, considerado como uno de los destacados especialistas en los campos de la economía, la ciencia política y la historia económica, distinguido por sus notables logros y contribuciones al estudio y reflexión sobre los procesos de desarrollo comparado en el largo plazo, en particular de los países latinoamericanos. Ciudad de México, al lunes 20 de febrero del 2023.
Procederemos a escuchar la laudatio que gentilmente nos ofrecerán, en primer lugar, la doctora Gómez-Galvarratio, profesora e investigadora del Centro de Estudios Históricos del Colegio de México. Le escuchamos.
Buenas tardes a todos. Es un gran honor para mí participar en esta ceremonia para otorgar el Premio Daniel Cosío Villegas en Ciencias Sociales 2022 al profesor James Robinson, a quien tuve la fortuna de conocer, asistir a sus clases y entablar una amistad en 2006 cuando realicé una estancia sabática en la Universidad de Harvard. Me alegra, por cierto, mucho ver aquí las caras de varios de mis estudiantes que en mis cursos han leído y estudiado la obra del profesor Robinson. Y bueno, muchas gracias por invitarme a participar en esta ceremonia. En particular hablaré de la valiosa contribución que ha hecho a través de su obra para comprender mejor las causas del atraso económico del sur global y en particular de América Latina. Una pregunta central a la que muchos pensadores han buscado dar respuesta, comenzando por Adam Smith en su libro La riqueza de las naciones. Desde entonces han surgido diversas explicaciones a la divergencia económica que se fue abriendo desde finales del siglo XVIII entre las naciones que lograron industrializarse y aumentar los niveles de vida de su población y aquellas que no lo consiguieron. Diversos factores han sido identificados por distintos estudiosos como la causa fundamental de este fenómeno: las diferencias culturales y religiosas, el clima, la geografía, la ausencia de conocimientos sobre las mejores políticas y prácticas. Otros trabajos se han enfocado en entender cómo las diferencias iniciales se exacerbaron como resultado del colonialismo, el imperialismo o el desigual papel que les tocó jugar dentro del sistema comercial y financiero global. Desde la década de 1980, particularmente gracias a la obra de Douglass North, comenzó a sumarse a estas explicaciones el papel de las instituciones, entendidas como las reglas del juego formales e informales que rigen el comportamiento social. A partir de ellas, iniciaron nuevas rutas de investigación para explicar el atraso de los países latinoamericanos, como las que emprendieron John Coatsworth o Stephen Haber, por ejemplo. Entre ellas, destacó un artículo que publicaron en 1997 Kenneth Sokoloff y Stanley Engerman, que se preguntaban sobre las causas de las grandes disparidades en el desarrollo de los países del continente americano. Ellos argumentaron que las diferencias no podían atribuirse a las características de los colonizadores, sino a las dotaciones de factores que encontraron al llegar, mismas que provocaron distintos niveles de desigualdad que a su vez generaron instituciones distintas, las cuales reforzaron la desigualdad y limitaron el desarrollo, al frenar el acceso a la educación, la innovación y el emprendimiento. Es en este debate intelectual donde se inserta la obra del economista y politólogo James Robinson, quien junto con Daron Acemoglu y Simon Johnson publicaron 2 artículos seminales que darían a estas ideas mayor precisión, extenderían sus alcances y les darían un sustento empírico sólido. Con enorme creatividad, lograron encontrar caminos para mostrar con datos los efectos de las instituciones en el desarrollo en el muy largo plazo. En uno de ellos utilizan la mortalidad de los colonizadores como instrumento cuantitativo para lograrlo, en otro lo hacen a través de los niveles de urbanización existentes cerca del año 1500, que someten a rigurosas pruebas econométricas utilizando muchos otros datos asequibles. En estos artículos argumentan que la causa primordial de la divergencia estriba en que las condiciones iniciales condujeron al desarrollo de distintas instituciones económicas, políticas y sociales. Por una parte, las instituciones extractivas, en las que la mayor parte de la población enfrenta el riesgo de expropiación y actos arbitrarios por parte del gobierno, la élite gobernante u otros agentes, y por la otra, las instituciones de propiedad privada, que ofrecen seguridad en los derechos de propiedad y permiten a aquellos con oportunidades productivas la posibilidad de recibir retornos a sus inversiones y a sus invenciones, por lo que están incentivados a hacerlas. Estos trabajos han abierto un nutrido debate que ha generado un amplio y fructífero campo de investigación que se ha abordado tanto desde la historia económica como desde otras trincheras de las ciencias sociales. Después de estos importantes artículos, James Robinson continuó trabajando con Daron Acemoglu en profundizar en estas ideas, no solo a través de investigación cuantitativa, sino también mediante estudios de caso y trabajos de campo utilizando metodologías cualitativas. Esta ruta de indagación los llevó a investigar sobre la relación entre democracia y desarrollo económico. Sus resultados los han publicado no solamente en artículos académicos, sino en obras que buscaron llegar a un público más amplio y lo consiguieron con éxito. Por ejemplo, en el libro Why Nations Fail, The Origin of Power, Prosperity and Poverty, traducido a 41 idiomas desde su publicación en 2012. Con el mismo objetivo, publicaron recientemente el libro The Narrow Corridor, States, Society and the Fate of Liberty, que examina la lucha inevitable entre gobiernos y sociedades y las enormes dificultades que enfrentan las democracias liberales para desarrollarse y sostenerse. Un tema crucial que preocupa a muchos países y entre ellos, de forma urgente, también a México. A lo largo de su trayectoria, James Robinson ha mostrado un especial interés por América Latina y ha contribuido al mundo académico no solo a través de sus publicaciones y su enseñanza en instituciones anglosajonas. Por más de 25 años ha impartido cursos en la Universidad de los Andes en Bogotá, Colombia, y en algunos países de África subsahariana. Y ha impartido diversas conferencias también en nuestro país. Su trayectoria lo hace un más que digno merecedor del premio que hoy se le otorga, con lo cual estoy segura que don Daniel Cosío Villegas estaría totalmente de acuerdo. Ojalá que este premio sirva también para que lo tengamos más frecuentemente en nuestro país y especialmente aquí en el colegio. Muchas gracias.
Gracias por su participación, doctora Gómez-Galvarratio. A continuación, escucharemos la laudatio del doctor Ángel Calderón, profesor investigador del Centro de Estudios Económicos del Colegio de México. Adelante.
Sí, buenas tardes. Quiero empezar por agradecer estas palabras haber sido invitado a dirigir estas palabras. Normalmente no lo traigo escrito, yo hubiera pedido que lo pusieran en la pantalla, no por otra cosa, porque se parece mucho al de Silvia, entonces van a decir que hubo plagio, que le copié la tarea, y quizás lo que se debe es que los dos venimos de un centro que forjó Daniel Cosío Villegas, y quizás a lo mejor con esas explicaciones históricas que luego dan, pues el colegio también estuvo mucho tiempo con historiadores y politólogos que resaltaron la imagen de Cosío Villegas como politólogo y como historiador. Entonces, no le copié la tarea, por eso quisiera que lo pusieran para que vean que sí lo traje y no lo había visto antes, ¿no? Sí, digo, pues es incuestionable los logros que el maestro Cosío Villegas tuvo como historiador y como analista político, pero también tuvo un destacado desempeño como economista. Y voy a ser un poco más abundante para que vean que sí lo había traído de manera distinta. Don Daniel tuvo una formación como economista estudiando en Estados Unidos, fue a Harvard, pasó un año, se metió a estudiar análisis económico, estadística, entre otras materias. Después siguió como estudiante de posgrado en economía agrícola en Wisconsin y en Cornell. Después tuvo oportunidad de ir a London School of Economics y tener algunos cursos de manera informal. A su regreso a México, tiene un destacado desempeño, como mencionaba la doctora Yarguli, en la creación de centros de investigación y docencia en economía. Para ser más precisos, participó en la creación de la sección de la Facultad de Derecho de la UNAM, que en 1933 se convirtió en la Escuela de Economía y fue su primer director durante 2 años. Como funcionario del Banco de México, impulsó la reorganización del Departamento de Estudios Económicos y apuntaló los trabajos de su oficina de investigaciones. En 1962, como ya lo comentábamos, ya como presidente del Colegio de México, forjó el Centro de Estudios Económicos y Demográficos, del que se desprende el Centro de Estudios de Desarrollo Urbano y el Centro de Economía unos años después, y en 1965, junto con Consuelo Meyer, elaboró el programa de licenciatura en Economía en la Universidad de Nuevo León. En 1944, tuvo la oportunidad de conocer economistas de la talla de John Maynard Keynes y Lionel Robbins, cuando formó parte, junto con Víctor Urquidi, de la delegación que representó a México en Bretton Woods. Como director y fundador de la revista El Trimestre Económico y de la editorial El Fondo de Cultura Económica, acercó a los lectores hispanoamericanos a las obras de los economistas más influyentes de sus tiempos y abrió importantes foros de análisis y debate. En 1948, después de más de 20 años de un destacado desempeño como economista, don Daniel integró al grupo de jóvenes economistas e historiadores con los que llevó a cabo durante más de 15 años los trabajos de investigación y redacción de la historia moderna de México, obra que es una de las referencias obligadas para el estudio sobre la Revolución y la República restaurada, así como el Porfiriato. De acuerdo con una biografía que hace Enrique Krause, don Daniel contaba ya con 47 años de edad cuando desembocó, me gustó la palabra que utilizó él, desembocó en la historia. ¿Todos cuántos años desembocaste en la historia?
Desde que nací.
No, también Ulises también es economista, historiador económico, politólogo, ¿no? Alguna vez. Desembocó en la historia a raíz de una polémica que sostuvo con José Revueltas y que lo llevó a reconocer que un ensayo escrito por él había sido un desacierto por su falta de análisis histórico. En una serie de entrevistas que el profesor de la Universidad de Berkeley, James Walkie, hizo a don Daniel en el año de 1964, el propio Cosío Villegas describe este proceso, Walkie le pregunta, ¿y cuándo empezó usted a escribir historia política? Don Daniel contesta, mire usted, yo publiqué aquí en la revista Cuadernos Americanos en el año de 1946 un ensayo que se llamó La crisis en México, que fue, digamos, el primer ensayo en el que trato de hacer un juicio crítico de lo conseguido por la Revolución Mexicana. Es decir, un ensayo en que se trataba de dar una idea de los objetivos que se propuso conseguir la Revolución Mexicana y de lo que realmente había conseguido. En México, ese ensayo armó un escándalo tremendo, con decirle a usted que hubo como 68 artículos publicados en todos los periódicos de México y desde luego ninguno de acuerdo conmigo. Pero de todos modos, a mí me dio la impresión de que la única lección que yo recibí de esta enorme cantidad de artículos y de redacciones violentas contra este ensayo fue que si yo quería seguir opinando sobre las cosas actuales de México, tenía yo que echarme un poco para atrás para ver el día de hoy con una cierta perspectiva histórica. Y entonces mi idea principal fue estudiar en forma el movimiento de la Revolución. Pero pensé que ni esto podía yo hacer en serio si no estudiaba la época anterior a la Revolución. Esto es lo que a James le encanta como History Path Dependence, ¿no? Y entonces comencé a estudiar el periodo de régimen de Díaz. De modo que esa fue la razón por la cual yo me eché para atrás y comencé a trabajar en las cosas históricas. Pienso acabar el año próximo esta historia, el 8º volumen, y entonces ya me sentiré más tranquilo para poder opinar sobre las cosas actuales del país. Lo que me parece a mí que es la principal lección que el maestro Cosío Villegas nos da con lo expresado en esta entrevista, tiene dos componentes. Uno, que para llegar a entender los determinantes de los problemas actuales del país y poder ofrecer soluciones adecuadas, se requiere un análisis económico con perspectiva histórica, y el otro componente, que para enriquecer nuestra comprensión de los fenómenos históricos y de las repercusiones que tienen en los procesos políticos, se requiere una buena dosis de análisis económico. James Robinson es un economista que se formó en London School of Economics y en las universidades de Warwick y Yale. Al igual que don Daniel, también desembocó en la historia y en el análisis político. Ha logrado consolidar una obra intelectual de carácter interdisciplinario que nos ayuda a entender qué es lo que determina que seamos tan prósperos, que no seamos tan prósperos como otras naciones. ¿Por qué nuestra distribución del ingreso empeora, mientras que en otros países mejora? ¿Y por qué nuestros indicadores de bienestar se estancan? Del trabajo de Robinson se concluye que para llegar a respuestas acertadas y proponer soluciones efectivas para México, debemos analizar los determinantes del largo proceso político que ha condicionado el actual funcionamiento de nuestras instituciones económicas, tarea que requiere de una perspectiva histórica. También se desprende que es imprescindible un claro entendimiento de por qué, más que incluyentes, de por qué deben de ser más incluyentes nuestras instituciones políticas y económicas, y mientras más lo sean, nuestro desarrollo será compartido y sostenido. Y aquí coincido con la doctora Aurora Gómez, no le copié la idea, no me la haré aquí de rebote, ¿no? Pero quizás es que parece que resulta obvio. La manera en que yo lo vería es que cuando nosotros ligamos con este premio el nombre de James Robinson al de Daniel Cosío Villegas y al del Colegio de México, implícitamente hacemos un reconocimiento a la relevancia que para las ciencias sociales y la historia sigue teniendo el trabajo académico interdisciplinario de don Daniel. James Robinson ha alcanzado gran notoriedad con 3 libros, como lo mencionaron ya, el origen de las democracias y dictaduras, por qué unas naciones crecen y otras no, y el corredor estrecho. Los últimos dos libros han sido traducidos a muchísimos idiomas y han alcanzado numerosos récords de ventas. Basta entrar en las tiendas y librerías de los aeropuertos internacionales de Europa y en otros países para darse cuenta de que son los más comprados por los pasajeros que tienen unas horas disponibles para leer algo interesante y entretenido. Tengo entendido que ya hasta los tienen en el nuevo aeropuerto Felipe Ángeles, en la tienda que se encuentra al lado del puesto de la señora que vende tlayudas. Para la elaboración de estos libros, los autores se basan en los resultados de investigaciones realizadas conjuntamente en los últimos 25 años y que han sido publicadas en las más destacadas revistas en economía y ciencia política. A diferencia del contenido de estos libros, el material desarrollado en estos artículos es de carácter especializado y son de un gran rigor analítico y empírico. Es pertinente comentar que en un pleno de profesores del Centro de Estudios Económicos, convocado para considerar propuestas al premio, votamos unánimemente por proponer a James Robinson. Cabe aclarar que lo hicimos tanto por la relevancia y actualidad de los temas que trabaja, como porque nuestra agenda de investigación y nuestro programa docente tienen una gran afinidad con sus métodos de análisis cuantitativo y con el rigor analítico de sus artículos. James Robinson es una persona a la que apreciamos y sentimos cercano al centro. Tuvimos oportunidad de convivir con él cuando dio un curso en nuestras aulas sobre el origen de la democracia y las dictaduras y una serie de conferencias durante un par de semanas mientras él llevaba a cabo unas investigaciones en el Archivo General de la Nación. Cuando el profesor Robinson aborda empíricamente un tema, demuestra su maestría en la solución de los problemas de identificación de econometría, lo que permite afirmar que la relación entre dos variables que analiza es de tipo causal y no una simple correlación. Ya mencionaba la doctora Gómez uno de sus artículos, no solo es que utilice un tipo de variables de la mortalidad en las colonias, etcétera, sino que resuelve un problema que en economía es difícil de abordar para tener certidumbre de que la correlación que se está viendo entre dos variables no se atribuye a otra variable que no está allí, o que la causalidad no es al revés, o que no es una correlación espuria. Entonces, el método de variables instrumentales, pues ese es realmente un reto para cualquier economista o científico social que está haciendo trabajo empírico, porque permite resolver ese problema y tener la certidumbre de que un instrumento, por increíble que sea, que es la mortalidad en 1800 o 1900 no sé qué, en África, pueda ser algo que se utiliza para tener la certeza de lo que estamos hablando de las instituciones de hoy en día son las que realmente están determinando los efectos o los resultados económicos y políticos que estamos viendo, y que no son otros los causantes de estos resultados, ¿no? Déjenme darles otro ejemplo, ¿no? Así como John Snow aprovechó en 1950 las condiciones creadas a manera de experimento natural por las distintas bombas de agua que abastecían a los habitantes de Londres, y pudo demostrar que, en contra de lo que todos pensaban, el agua contaminada era la causante del cólera, Robinson logró aprovechar condiciones creadas a manera de un experimento natural para demostrar que las instituciones son la determinante de la prosperidad de las naciones. Para ello, a la manera de Snow, utilizó mapas y datos de las zonas alemanas en donde hubo intervención napoleónica, y las tomó como grupo de tratamiento, y las zonas aledañas en las que no lo hubo, las tomó como grupo de control para sus análisis. Sus artículos sobre el origen de la democracia en Inglaterra y los determinantes de lo que ellos, junto con Aarón Acemoglu, ha denominado el corredor estrecho, contienen una rigurosa e ingeniosa aplicación de la teoría de juegos y de otras técnicas de análisis económico. De esta forma, Robinson y Acemoglu logran contar con un marco analítico consistente con los relatos históricos que explican. A veces se piensa que economía es curvas de demanda y oferta, pero economía también es algo más. O sea, de hecho, a mí me parece interesante recordar la forma en que James Robinson conoce a Aarón Acemoglu. Corrígeme si estoy en el error, pero esto fue de haber sido en 1993. A James Robinson lo invitaron a dar un seminario en London School of Economics y tenía ahí como parte de la audiencia a unos estudiantes, ¿no? Ya medio latosos con él, ¿no? La conferencia el seminario era sobre teoría de juegos dinámicos, si no me equivoco. Estaban sentados, además de otros economistas que ahora están bastante renombrados, nada más ni nada menos que Piketty, Tomás Piketty, era uno de los que estaba ahí como alumno, y estaba Aarón Acemoglu. Y luego se fueron a cenar y seguramente han de haber hablado de teoría de juegos, ¿no? Entonces, esto fue en 1992, y tengo entendido que siguieron de ahí una relación entre James Robinson y Aarón Acemoglu, y siguieron discutiendo de un tema que les interesaba, que era la democracia, etcétera. Después en 95 se volvieron a juntar y volvieron a hacer una primera versión y luego otra versión, y después de 3 años como que sacaron un primer working paper. O sea, estamos hablando de un artículo que pasa a ser un artículo muy relevante, que ahora todo es obligado para todos, que se publica en el año 2000, ¿no? Y es una aplicación de un juego dinámico, nada más que ahora es algunos aspectos económicos de por qué la democracia se expande, o el voto se expande entre los ingleses, ¿no? Que es interesante ver cómo finalmente esa interacción entre una élite o un grupo y otra ciudadanía, y uno tiene el poder o no, pero es un juego dinámico con visiones hasta hacia el futuro, etcétera, diferentes posibilidades, ¿no? Y cómo hay ahí un elemento de cómo se puede darle la vuelta a lo que se llama el problema político de Quas, de cómo logran el compromiso intertemporal de un grupo que me estaba amenazando con una revolución, ¿no? Y yo que sí quiero darles, pero si les doy ahorita, a lo mejor no me lo creen. Entonces la única manera que me van a creer a través del tiempo es que les dé más votos, al menos así lo entendí, porque nomás leí la introducción, pero todavía, el del narrow corridor está todavía más elaborado, ¿no? Ese es así como una teoría de juegos en la cual además de que interactúan, y el otro, como si fueran así dos empresas, que una está innovando y le está ganando el mercado a uno, y luego está innovando, está ganando el otro, y lo que es más relevante a mí me pareció de todo es que el hecho de que una sea más fuerte permite que la otra, o en última instancia, es más fuerte, y al ser más fuerte el Estado y la sociedad civil, se va logrando ese corredor que nos va a permitir más prosperidad, más inclusión política y social. La mala noticia es que si destruimos nuestras instituciones y las hacemos más débiles, entonces va a haber menos incentivo en que la sociedad civil participe y presione para que tengamos regresemos a ese corredor estrecho y podamos tener más progreso y prosperidad. Pero de que es un parteaguas en el análisis de este tipo de problemas o de fenómenos, lo que es interesante es que es el relato histórico, según yo entendería, lo que guía el tratar de dar el entendimiento al problema, y no al revés. No vamos a ajustar el problema al modelito que sí podemos resolver, ¿no? Entonces, pero lo que también quisiera enfatizar es que James Robinson es alguien que, a pesar de la cantidad de producción de artículos y libros que tiene. No es un investigador que se la pasa en su oficina o trabajando en su casa. Es alguien que cree que en los trabajos de campo, que cree que puede aprender mucho yendo a participar y a convivir con culturas distintas, con países distintos. Estoy seguro que en su pasaporte, en sus últimos 2 pasaportes, ha de estar todo lleno de sellos de todos los países en los que ha estado trabajando. O sea, sí es un experto en África, es un experto en América Latina, ha hecho trabajo de campo en Bolivia, en Perú, muchísimo en Colombia, va a Haití y por otro lado se pasa en República del Congo, en Sierra Leona, ¿qué otros países de África? Son pues, muchísimos países de África, ¿no? Son varios los países de África donde ha hecho trabajo de campo, ¿no? Entonces está constantemente, es un enfoque como muy completo el que el profesor Robinson tiene como agenda de investigación y yo quisiera ahí acabar mis comentarios y realmente pues, otra vez más agradecer el espacio para expresar estas ideas. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, doctor Calderón, por su intervención. Es momento de conceder la palabra al doctor James C. Robinson, director del Instituto Pearson para el Estudio y Resolución de Conflictos Globales de la Escuela Harris de Política Pública de la Universidad de Chicago, quien dictará su conferencia magistral A Conditional Iron Law of Oligarchy in Latin America, Evidence from Colombia.
Okay. Muchas gracias. Desafortunadamente, voy a hablar en inglés. But I'd like to say what an honor it is. I'm very honored and very delighted to be here in El Colegio de México, receiving the prize, and thank you for all the very generous words, which I don't deserve. I was sitting there thinking, who are they talking about? Anyway, it's. I guess this is a moment where people say things like that, and I'm very grateful and very honored. And you know, I read a little bit about Senor Villegas also, and you know, he was a very interesting man, as you were saying. And the word, you know, multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary has come up quite a bit. And he was obviously, that was him. You know, he started as an economist. Like me, he studied at the London School of Economics. And, you know, but he realized that, you know, to understand what he was interested in understanding, he had to go beyond economics as he was taught. He had to think about politics. He had to think about history. And I think that's been very much my journey. I've always been driven by questions about the world and why the world is the way it is, and how could it be different, and how could you make it different. And it's the question that matters, and then you have to find the right concepts and the right tools wherever they are, whether they're in economics, whether they're in political science, whether they're in history. And for me, I've found that it's a great source of creativity and thought, and different people have different methodologies. So I like this. Senor Villegas, Dr. Villegas was obviously very much a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary person. So I'm very honored to get the prize from that perspective, because it seems like, you know, I find many echoes of my own career in his, although I was never a public servant. I think I would have been very bad at that. Okay, so I tried to decide what to talk about today, and I'm going to talk about some of my work with two of my colleagues at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, it came up. I've taught for many, many years at the Universidad de los Andes, and Leopoldo Ferguson, who was a student of mine, he took my class in Bogota, then I supervised his PhD dissertation in the United States, and now he's a professor in Bogota. And Santiago Torres, who's on the faculty, he's a student, a very brilliant student at Los Andes. And I wanted to talk about, I think it's the topic we're thinking about. I always like to talk about the research I'm doing rather than what I used to do, but I think it's work we're doing. It's mostly, all the data is going to be for Colombia, but I have a feeling that it will resonate with some of the challenges that you're experiencing in Mexico today. And I thought it was appropriate because it's research which is really on these kind of questions about long-run development in Latin America and the long-run divergence in economics and politics, which I've been thinking about for many years with Professor Acemoglu. Yes, I think we had our 30th anniversary recently, but we're still very good friends, and there's a lot to understand still. So this is called the conditional iron law of oligarchy in Latin America. Evidence from Colombia. The data is going to come from Colombia, but as I say, I think the challenges exist everywhere. And let me. How did we start thinking about this research? So the phrase, the iron law of oligarchy, goes back to the great German sociologist, Robert Michels, who was a sort of anti-Marxist. And Marx had this idea of progress in history. There was going to be, feudalism, and then there was going to be capitalism, and then there was going to be sort of socialism, and there was a sort of progress. There was this, and so Pareto and Michels, sort of proposed this anti-Marxist idea that, you don't really have progress. You don't really have progress. That maybe things change, the faces change, but there's always elites, and there's always people being exploited by elites. So I think, so just that's the iron law of oligarchy. The iron law of oligarchy is, things may change, but really they look like they're changing, but in some structural way they're the same. And so we're trying to understand whether this is what's going on in Latin America, because there's so much change, and we're going to focus on the Colombian case, but just as some sort of motivation, Professor Gómez-Galvarratio was sort of talking about some of the seminal research on long-run development in Latin America that was, the work of Engelman and Sokolov and Steve Haber that was so inspiring, and John Coatsworth that was so inspiring for our research. And a lot of that emphasizes the sort of deep historical roots of inequality and underdevelopment in Latin America, and this sort of historical burden. But if you look around the region today, you see sort of what appears to be a tectonic change in Latin America. We have in El Salvador, in Chile, in Colombia. We have a black vice president in Colombia, a black female vice president, something unimaginable 20 years ago in Colombia, maybe even 10 years ago. An amazing thing, you have President López Obrador. Whoever put these people in power, it wasn't some archaic or historic elite, it was democracy. So this seems to be a sort of staggering change in the region. And what I'm going to show you is that at least in Colombia, this is happening at kind of all levels. But the question is, what's the impact? What's the impact of this? And the impact of this seems to be much less than you might imagine, and that's what we're trying to study. Okay, so just to sort of talk about this in a more kind of systematic way, this is just looking at the change I'll start by talking a little bit about the region more broadly before I zoom in on Colombia. But, if I just look kind of historically, the black line here is Latin American and the Caribbean. This is the share of elections. This is for national legislatures. So one of the problems with these slides, I realized, is that I go back between different types of political institutions. So let me try to be very careful about where the data comes from. So this is just looking at different regions in the world at the share of turnover in elections for the national legislature, meaning what? It means the proportion of, turnovers, so the proportion of people who lose elections where new people are coming in. And you can see in Latin America, this is dramatically increased, so according to this data, there's more political turnovers in Latin America than there is anywhere else in the world. So the share of elections with turnovers goes to about 50%. So in 50% of elections for national legislatures, old people are replaced and new people come in. Okay? So that would be a very standard measure of political competitiveness. And if you think the problem in Latin America historically has been the lack of political competitiveness, the lack of accountability, then this seems to be an enormous increase in potentially in accountability and political competition, or even political inclusion, using the language of Why Nations Fail. Okay, so you can see, of course, this is happening all over the world. That's partly to do with the collapse of the Soviet Union, with democratization in Southern Europe and throughout Sub-Saharan Africa in the 1990s. So the so-called third wave of democratization. So that didn't just happen in Latin America, of course, but it's a dramatic change in Latin America, I think we can agree. Okay, so and a lot of the traditional story of Latin America, the continent of oligarchs and elites and haciendas and whatever, this is just some fun stuff from Samuel Stone, who's a Costa Rican sociologist. He has this book called the history, the legacy of the conquistadors, and he constructed how many descendants of the Juan Vázquez de Coronado, the conquistador, how many descendants of his actually were involved in politics in Central America in the 20th century. And it's a pretty crazy list, of many people, presidents, diputados. So he has this book sort of drawing this direct kind of, legacy of the conquistadors and kind of contemporary Central American politics. And, Central America, of course, has been most studied by this. Jeffrey Page, who's a sociologist at Michigan, has this book called Coffee and Power, where he documents in detail the kind of structure of these elites, especially in El Salvador and Guatemala. So, if this is your image of Latin America's problems, then it's pretty startling, the change that's happening in Latin America at the moment. So this can't explain anything about Latin America anymore. That's kind of my starting point. Here is just thinking about democracy more general. Perhaps this is a bit redundant, given what I just showed you. But again, this is just an index created by VDEM, which is a project in Sweden. Goes between 0, sort of the least democratic, to 1, the most democratic. I like this data more than most data on democratization because it actually takes seriously women voting and women's enfranchisement. Many indices of democracy, you find that the United States was as democratic as it could possibly be in 1820, when women couldn't vote, when black people couldn't vote. So this takes these issues a bit more seriously. So you might say, if I look at North America, if I look at North America in the 1920s or whatever, then it's more democratic than Latin America. And of course, that's a robust prediction going back. If I just look at, say, the proportion of white males that were enfranchised, that's much greater in North America than it is, in Latin America, going back historically. But of course, black people couldn't vote in the southern United States until the middle of the 1960s. So there's many problems, and this takes those problems much more seriously. But nevertheless, it shows, very dramatically since 1970, this uptake of democracy in Latin America and this convergence towards North America. Okay, so, and just think of all these structural changes. If you're familiar with some of this literature, that people emphasize these deep roots of inequality in Latin America and marginalization and exclusion. There's this emphasis on agriculture, but agriculture has kind of completely withered away as a share of national income in Latin America. Constitutions have changed. The constitutional change has been much more egalitarian, much more emphasizing rights and social rights. There's been enormous expansion of education and the emergence of civil society in many ways, in a way that you hadn't seen before. You've seen that in Colombia, in Chile, in many places. Okay, but, and I'll get much more precise about this when I start talking about Colombia. I think we're all aware that at some bigger level, not much seems to have changed. Not much seems to have changed in terms of dramatic different economic trajectories. Certainly not much has changed in terms of inequality. The yellow line at the top here is inequality in Latin America. Despite the rise of inequality, the very dramatic rise of inequality in some parts of the Western world, especially Britain and Anglo-Saxon world in particular, in the United States, Britain, not so much in other, not so much in Scandinavia, not so much in France, but despite this rise in inequality, levels of inequality are far higher in Latin America and probably, very underestimated. And inequality seems to be dramatically persistent. So a lot of the emphasis of the work by Engelman and Sokolov and others trying to understand the persistence of inequality and how the persistence of inequality in Latin America was associated with persistence of underdevelopment. Despite all this political change, the inequality remains highly inertial, and we don't seem to have seen the sort of dramatic change in the economic trajectories that you might have hoped would come with that dramatic increase in political inclusion. Okay, so I think we can start thinking about why that is, and I'm going to push on this one aspect of it connected to the so-called iron law of oligarchy. I started citing academic papers here, and I immediately regretted it. So I apologize. Some remained. I think political scientists have started thinking about, why has democratization been disappointing in Latin America? I think the great Argentine political scientist Guillermo O'Donnell was one of the first people who started articulating ideas about why this was. You could think that democracies have risen, but it's very low quality. That's what political scientists would say. It's very clientelistic. So yes, democracy has happened, but citizens are engaged in the democratic process in a very clientelistic, very personalized way, which mitigates against the provision of public goods, that are absolutely critical to reduce inequality and stimulate economic growth. You could imagine elements of, pre-democratic elite capture, but I've already shown you data to suggest that's probably not what's going on. So I don't want to dwell on that. You could think of very specific examples of that in Latin America. I could cite examples, you can think of examples, but I don't think that's the general picture. But rather, I think what the argument I'm going to try to develop is that, the picture that Michael's painted all these years before the First World War, is the new elites. And I want to say something about, these ideas actually have been experimented with in Latin America before, particularly in the case of Bolivia and the Bolivian Revolution. There's a brilliant book by Herbert Klein, who was also honored by El Colegio de Mexico for a prize in the humanities here, a wonderful historian. Kelly and Klein wrote a book in 1981 trying to apply Michael's ideas to the Bolivian Revolution and why the Bolivian Revolution in the 1950s had not led to a transformation in Bolivian society. And Dwight Heath, who was an anthropologist at Brown, also did a marvelous case study in the Yungas region of Bolivia, of the transition from pre-revolutionary to post-revolutionary elites at a kind of micro-ethnographic level. It's an absolutely fabulous piece of work. So there've been, I don't want to go into details, but there've been antecedents of this. We're trying to look at this much more systematically with data from Colombia. Okay, so let me start. I'm always conscious about talking too much. So let me start talking about the data. So you know what the agenda is. The agenda is to try to look at all of these newcomers coming into politics, new people displacing old people. Try to look systematically at the effect of these newcomers on economic performance, on public policy, on inequality, and try to understand, are the newcomers really changing things or not? And if not, why not? Okay, all right. And the first thing I want to say is, if you look at Colombia, up until 1990, this is 1991, the Colombians rewrote the constitution. You can see that before 1990, Colombia is a very good approximation of a traditional idea about Latin American underdevelopment. There's two political parties, the conservatives and liberals, very elitist. They formed, you could argue, in the 1830s, 1840s. I mean, some people would say even earlier, but certainly by the 1850s, they were contesting power politically. There was a sort of political oligarchy. In fact, after 1958, there was this National Front agreement that basically divided power between conservatives and liberals. Everybody else was excluded. There were no real elections. And that's what started the Marxist guerrilla group that President Petro was a member of, M19. That started actually after the 1970 presidential election, which was fixed. So some people got angry, and then they went, to the monte, as they say. So here, here's the old Latin American equilibrium. I think, Colombia is a very good example of this very elitist, old Latin American equilibrium. But what you can see is that looks like it's completely disintegrated since 1990. The 1991 Constitution sort of opened up the political field for all sorts of new actors. So this is just the number of political parties in Colombia. So you can see that the number of political parties has rocketed. This spike and going down is that there's changes in legislation, and the initial thing falls because they introduce this threshold to get representation in Congress, and that affects a number of parties. But there's been an enormous increase in the number of political parties. Crazy increase in number of political parties. A lot of that is because many of them are local. Okay, but I think just to show you this is real, this is not cosmetic, we could look at, the number of political parties, who are these political parties? And you can see that, and this is one of the fruits of the Constitution, talking about, representation, talking about a more inclusive society. Many of them are Afro-Colombian parties, indigenous parties. In fact, the majority of them are previously extremely marginalized minorities, are now starting parties. And it's not just starting, there's also ex-guerrilla parties here, like M19, which was President Petro's party. They're still sort of going. So a lot of them are, just to show, many of these parties are sort of representing previously marginalized people who finally have a voice in the political system in Colombia. And this is it's not just a cosmetic thing. These people really have power, okay? So if you looking at municipal elections, so looking at elections for much less in national institutions, but if I look at elections for mayors, then you see this is extremely successful. So about 25% of mayors in Colombia now, it's like about 1,400 municipalities. About 25% of mayors are coming from these new parties, from Afro-Colombian parties, from indigenous parties, close to 15%, which is actually really remarkable, and many other parties, many local kind of more idiosyncratic parties. But just to show, this is a remarkable transition at this local level. Okay, of course, before 1988, mayors and governors were appointed. And that the election of mayors is a sort of fundamental, that's a very massive democratization in Colombia. But initially, the proportion of, the liberals and conservatives controlled everything. But the political machines have crumbled at the local level. And so there's real political inclusion here. Okay? And one thing we did is to say, okay, so new people are getting elected. How do we know that means anything? So we did text analysis of speeches in Congress and looking at, sort of topics of legislation also. And we tried to distinguish between distinctively non-newcomers, so a sort of traditional politician, someone traditionally associated with the liberals or conservative parties. Well, there's a lot of flux in that now. And we sort of say someone who's a distinctively newcomer, who we could really sort of say was somebody who'd come into Congress. So this, again, now I'm switching. Before, the last picture I showed you, elections for mayors and representation of mayors. So now I'm looking at the National Congress, and what you see is someone who you could identify as being someone who's definitely new, sort of entering Congress for the first time. They're talking about different things and they're proposing different things. They're talking about the environment, social security and health, welfare, poverty, public administration. What about distinctively non-newcomers? Celebrations, honors, and monuments. Excuse me, I'm just recovering from a cold. Public contracts, of course, we're interested in public contracts. So just to see, with administrative affairs, international humanitarian rights, that might be important. Not to say that one thing is more important than another, but just to say they're talking about new things. So I think it's plausible that many of these new people are raising new issues. You see indigenous people, Afro-Colombian people, they're clearly raising different issues, and you see that in legislative projects, you see it in the debate in Congress, okay? And I'm talking too much about that, but just to show, if you estimate the sort of hazard rate, you can see that the probability of staying in Congress has dramatically fallen. So this is just another way of saying that things are getting much more competitive, okay? And breaking this down, the share of newcomers, what do I mean by a newcomer? I mean someone who's never held public office before. Okay, elected public office before. So you can see in the Senate, again, there's a dramatic increase, in the 1990s. In the Cámara, there's a dramatic increase. Governors, less, regional assemblies, alcaldes, councillors, so this is a dramatic shift in national legislative institutions. So just with the Colombian evidence. Okay, but now let's talk about what's the effect of this. What's the effect of this? Okay, and to know what the effect is, you have to use some economic methodology here because it's pretty complicated. Okay, if I think about the problem here, I'm going to focus on the municipal level, on mayors. Does having a newcomer mayor change anything? Okay, so of course, newcomer mayors don't get elected in one place rather than another at random, okay? So if I look at municipalities and I just compare places where a newcomer mayor comes, so someone gets elected with no previous history in politics versus a kind of someone with more of a history in politics, those places don't look similar. They look different in terms of development outcomes and many other things. So I want to compare like to like in order to know what's the effect of having a newcomer mayor on public policy or some development outcome. So the way we do this, I won't talk about the technical aspect of this too much, but the idea is to sort of compare close elections. So we want to compare elections where a newcomer mayor just won to a place where a newcomer mayor almost won but didn't win. And the idea is that those places are kind of more comparable than just looking at all the places where newcomers won and all the places where they didn't win. If we look at where there's just a kind of narrow difference, it's almost idiosyncratic. Oh, the newcomer mayor could have won, but they didn't win. And in another place, the newcomer mayor did win, but they could have lost. Those things are more comparable. So all these estimates are going to come from that type of exercise. It's called regression discontinuity analysis. Okay? And what I want to tell you is I'm going to talk about, we look at this public policy outcomes in lots of different dimensions with respect to public service provision, with respect to education, with respect to health, measured in different ways, kind of economic outcomes, and a sort of security, just like order or the absence of violence. There's a big thing in Colombia, maybe Mexico too, okay? So what I want to show you is, so here, so these are the sort of 5 components, and we can aggregate these components into an index of public service provision, education, health, etc., the economy and security. And here's the overall index, okay? And what that means, being on the 0, it means that on average, if I compare newcomer mayors to newcomer mayors, I look at municipalities where newcomer mayors just won to municipalities where newcomer mayors just lost, there's no difference, okay? That's 0, okay? So if you look at it, you find some things, for example, education, it seems that on average, I'm going to show you in a second, it's a little more complicated than this, but just looking at this so far, you see, on average, the fact that this is positive means that education outcomes do seem to improve when you get a newcomer. Okay, that's good. But on the other hand, other things look bad. So, for example, health, so why doesn't that lead to an overall improvement? Well, there seems to be some evidence on average, health declines, that health declines, there seems to be a fall in the availability of health facilities for example. So, but you can see most of these things are clustered around 0. You see, again, some other deterioration here. I don't want to put too much emphasis on one thing. I think the education thing, I'm going to unpack that a bit. I think that's something we're very concerned about and interested in. And at least here, there does seem to be some improvement on education. But in the overall index, that's counterbalanced by negatives elsewhere. Okay, so for now, I want to emphasize this overall 0, that there doesn't seem to be improvement. Okay, so and here's even worse. This picture is even worse here, because you might think, okay, well, what about corruption? Like we're concerned about corruption, and so we put together data from the kind of Colombian government's watchdog agency on complaints. So you might ask, okay, let's look at are newcomer mayors who are they less corrupt? Is there less evidence for corruption? Looking at complaints, basically complaints that maladministration or procedures weren't done properly. And here we can do this kind of, I'm just showing you the data in a little bit different because of the nature of this data, we can look over time. And you can see here that there's not really much change. So again, this is around 0. 0 means not that there's no complaints. It means that there's no difference between places where newcomer mayors get elected and places where they just fail to get elected. So if it was really true that that newcomer mayors would be associated with less corruption, what would you expect here? You'd expect this to be actually negative, okay? But it's not negative. If anything, it's not statistically significant, but actually, if anything, it's positive. So there's different ways. This is like the total complaints in a municipality. This is complaints against the mayor. We could ask about, well, maybe it's not just about mayors, but it's about who the mayor hires. So you can look at complaints against all, people working in the alcaldía, or complaints against concejales. Maybe, the mayor, it's not, the corruption is elsewhere. So we should look at the sort of whether there's externalities. But again, you don't see anything very much against here. So this suggests that newcomers don't seem to be less corrupt. That would be one interpretation of that data either. Okay? And, even worse, you could say, so now I'm jumping back to the national legislative institutions. I warned you a little bit. I'm jumping backwards and forwards between local government and the national government. But one exercise we did also was to look at voting patterns in the Cámara and Senado and look at the extent to which newcomers sort of voted differently or similarly with sort of more traditional incumbent politicians. And what you see is that the longer newcomers stay in power, the more they vote with more traditional politicians. So this would be sort of consistent with this idea that they come to power, they have new ideas, but in the end they get sort of captured, by traditional politicians. Okay, but let me go back now to this index. So this development index, and comparing new mayors where they win and where they just win and where they just lose. Okay, and now I want to sort of say, okay, but one of the advantages of studying Colombia, it's probably true of Mexico too. Colombia is not one country. Colombia is 10 countries, or 15 countries. There's enormous variation within Colombia, in the culture, in inequality, in history, and etc. So you can exploit that variation to sort of see whether this is the pattern on average, but you're averaging interesting things together. And so what we try to do here is to sort of say, I'm not going to talk about all of this, just a couple of things. But inequality, what do we do here? Well, let me divide Colombia into, two sets of municipalities. Low inequality and high inequality, so kind of below median inequality. Let me call that low inequality, and above median inequality, you call that high inequality. Okay, so the pink diamonds are relatively equal parts of Colombia, and what you see here is that education. So this is my development index, and these are these indices of public services. So when I showed you this picture here, I was talking about there's no effect here on average. There is an improvement in education, okay? But now what you can see here is that improvement in education is only coming from places with low levels of inequality, okay? In fact, there's no improvement in education outcomes in the half of Colombia with high levels of inequality. So I said, on average, there's this improvement in education, but what you see is actually it's totally driven by places with low levels of inequality. Okay, so inequality here. You know, so just what I'm here is I'm just sort of thinking about the heterogeneity within Colombia. The more unequal parts of Colombia, the less unequal parts of Colombia. And if I look here at violence intensity, like just looking at using data on the number of violent incidents in Colombia and just separating it from below, you know, kind of more less violent and more violent, you see pink is below median, so less violent places. You see in parts of Colombia with less violence, there's actually massive improvement all over in everything here, in terms of the economic performance, in terms of education, in terms of public service, and in this development index, okay? So you could look at this development index and say, well, on average, these newcomers are not doing anything. But what this shows you is they are doing something, but only in some circumstances. It's only in some conditions when they're able to actually do things, okay? And that's, in the Colombian case, is particularly connected to security, of course, not a surprise, but maybe that's a pretty big issue in Mexico as well, but it's also linked. It's also linked to inequality. Okay, and in fact, you know, to just show one more thing that I find extremely interesting is, again, I showed you that on average, you know, there's no newcomer mayors seem to be just as corrupt or accused of being corrupt, just as corrupt as sort of old politicians. When you break that down between low inequality Colombia and high inequality, so I kind of separate low inequality from high inequality Colombia, what you see, you know, in low inequality is, you know, this line, and not without going into the technical details, this jump down, think about zero as being, you know, if I'm to the right of zero, that's when a newcomer mayor just wins. And if I'm to the left of zero, that's the place where the newcomer just lost, okay? So what you see here, this jump down is basically the effect of having a newcomer mayor. You see actually there's a significant fall in the probability of being corrupt, okay? But only in low inequality places. In high inequality places, it's actually the other way around, okay? So the story here is that, newcomers do make a difference, but whether they make a difference is heavily dependent on the underlying structural features, in particularly inequality and order, public order and violence. So if you went back, sorry, to my initial motivation, I think you could say, one way of saying the story here that appears from the data, I hope this hasn't been too technical here, but one picture that appears from the Colombian data is that, I think Colombia, 30 years ago, Colombia did not have a political system which was consistent with it becoming a prosperous and successful country. It had a highly elitist, oligarchic political system, and that's disintegrated, for many reasons. One of them was Pablo Escobar, and the guerrilla, and it was Pablo Escobar that murdered, murdered Luis Carlos Galán, that led to the rewrite of the Constitution more than anything else, so it's interesting irony of history. But for whatever reason, and also, the recognition by Colombian elites that it wasn't sustainable, the society. The election of mayors in 1988, was a recognition that they had to open the political system. But I think what you see is that in some sense this is necessary, maybe, but it's not sufficient without strategies for really addressing some of these fundamental structural problems in Colombia to do with order and violence and inequality. And when you don't address those problems, you see, on average, there's no improvement in development outcomes, in policy outcomes. And so it's a very vicious circle whereby even massive political inclusion, because of the underlying structures, does not lead to the type of public policies that could actually break the equilibrium or change the equilibrium. And I think, I think it's related to what Michaels was talking about. But it's all sloping here. But let me finish with just one thought, which is, it's related to what Michaels was talking about, but I think it's less cynical, actually, also, and more optimistic, for the following reason, which is that, think about, emphasizing this heterogeneity with respect to inequality. So, you might ask yourself the question, well, why is it that, newcomers don't improve on public policy when there's high levels of inequality? They could be bribed. Local elites could bribe them. So even somebody who has a genuine agenda and genuinely wants to change the society, they value money too. There's a trade-off, as economists would say, between implementing your policy and stealing. And so, the corruption, the incentives to be corrupt are, maybe higher in places more inequality. I think what that's picking up within Colombia is, concentration of local elite power, and they're better able to control the political system, better able to corrupt new people who come to power. And, one can think of many examples of that of Colombia, But I doubt that that's the whole story, in fact. And I think, what you see in this case here is that actually it's not just that new people get corrupted, but state capacity is weak and there's violence. And then it's very difficult to implement your preferred policies in that type of context. So no matter how well-meaning you are, if you have to deal with armed actors, non-state armed actors, and threats of security and violence, then it's very difficult to implement change or change anything. So I don't want you to go away thinking, okay, what's the underlying mechanism here is like corruption, or these people are all corrupt and they're selling out. And I don't think that is the first order story. Like, for me, the first order story is no matter how well-intentioned you are, you can't change anything, without some institutional capacity, without state capacity, without a control over violence and violent actors and order, which has been a Colombian problem for many, many years. And so I think so what we're trying to do now is sort of dig into that next layer of here, the next layer of this, and I think, again, to go back to this picture, which, on the left shows, which I think is sort of, it's kind of against this corruption story. It sort of says, well, in places with low inequality, there's really a fall in accusations against these mayors. So in a place where you have more chance of implementing your preferred policy, you see corruption go down, you see, that people behave better. And okay, so I think there's too many things to talk about here. So I think it's like the iron law of oligarchy in the sense of, new people. Michaels was very cynical. He thought new people come, they become elites, and society always has elites and non-elites, and there's no chance of real sociological change. I think what you see in Latin America, at least talking about the Colombian cases, you see enormous change. And the question is, do we see a new elite class emerging? Do we see the structural situation reinforcing itself? And I think, on some average level, the data is consistent with that, but we call it the conditional iron law of oligarchy because when you dig into the data, you see, that's conditional on these underlying structural features. And I think it's not easy to deal with those problems. But there has been progress, at least on violence in Colombia, in the last decades. And that's a hopeful sign. Progress on inequality remains to be seen. But I think that's a more optimistic picture than just saying, it's the iron law of oligarchy, there's some deep sociological law, there's always elites and non-elites, and okay.
Sí, a lo mejor como vamos bien de tiempo, a lo mejor un par de preguntas. ¿Sí? Como vamos muy bien de tiempo, yo creo que podemos incluir un par de preguntas que hubiera de parte del auditorio. Pues si quieren, pásenle micrófonos de aquí. Pero este no, porque este parpadea mejor.
Hello? Yes. Yeah, this is working right. Well, thank you very much for the presentation, Dr. Robinson. Sorry, yeah. I'm Oscar Rojano. I'm a master student at the Master in Institutions and Political Economy at the University of Barcelona. So my question is the following. If you were talking about this vicious circle that it's also related to the concept of weak state trap, that it was proposed by you and Professor Ferguson, what are the chances of increasing the state capacity in countries such as Colombia if, at the end of the day, state capacity is a product of the historical development, right? As you have suggested in the past, also Professor Acemoglu, if this is a concept and it's a product of a historical development, how is it possible that nowadays, facing like the current conditions, countries such as Colombia or Mexico may be able to increase this state capacity? Because at the end of the day, as you know and you have suggested in the past, there is like this interplay between clientelism and tax evasion, that these are conditionals that need to be avoided in order to increase state capacity. Therefore, is there a way, or is there some paths to follow in order to break this chain, this vicious circle? That would be the question, and thank you very much for the presentation.
Yeah, do I answer? Yes, you can hear me? Yes. I think there is scope for doing it, and that's related to the democratization of Latin America. I think Colombia just had the most democratic election it ever had in its entire 200-year history, for sure. If you look at the map of who voted for the president and President Petro, and it's like the periphery, it's like the Pacifico, the Caribbean coast, it's Bogota also, but it's people are getting a voice who've never had a voice before. And I think that makes many things possible, but the question is how you build the institutions. I think in the case of Colombia, you have examples of development of state capacity of institutions. In Bogota, for example, when Antanas Mocas was mayor of Bogota, there was dramatic improvements in the functionality of the state, the fiscal capacity of the state, in order, in security. In Medellin, you see the same thing. Medellin is a sort of dramatically different place than it was 30 years ago. And a lot of that is to do with building state institutions in capacity. Of course, other parts of the country are just as bad or even worse than they were. And many of those projects are hard to sustain, So, I won't go into details, but I'm just saying, I think this democratic window, does create lots of potential for changing things. Of course, you're right, he's referring to this research I did looking at, with Leopoldo Ferguson, looking at at the individual level, at the connection between sort of tax evasion as a measure of the weakness of the state, or the kind of, your attitudes, people's attitudes towards the state, and clientelism. What we showed is that people who sell their votes in elections are far more likely to evade taxes. So there's a sort of vicious circle of state weakness and clientelism. But if you dig into that, so that's statistically significant, okay. But if you dig into the data, and you ask, okay, but what proportion of the sample? Antanas Mocas asked me, he said, are all the Colombians at it? Are all the Colombians doing it? And the answer to that is no. It's actually, in the data, it's only 26% of the sample sell their vote and evade taxes. So some people sell their vote and don't evade taxes. Some people do the opposite. And guess what? A majority of 55% of Colombians don't do either, So it's almost like the tail wagging the dog, in Colombia. But that's a good thing, because there's plenty of scope for change. There's plenty of for changing things. So I think like one thing that's important about that data, as I say, is if you look at the numbers, like look at not the statistical significance or the regression, but just the descriptive statistics, you see like, many Colombians are not happy with the system. They don't sell their vote, they don't evade taxes, but they don't know how to change things. How is change going to come? How is that going to happen? And so I think there's a lot of scope for political projects which can build institutions and get out of that equilibrium. Yeah.
Gracias. Una más, Reinaldo Ortega, y luego una por ahí atrás.
Okay, yes. Thank you very much for very interesting talk and the arguments that you... Reinaldo Ortega from the Center for International Studies here at Colegio México. Very interesting talk. I was thinking of two questions. One is, in terms of Michel's iron law, he insisted in two types of mechanisms for explaining the reproduction of these oligarchies or elites. One was structural, as you said, in terms of what is the party that you are studying, in this case, what's the country that you're studying. But there were others which were, one, psychological, in terms of the representative or no of the leader. But I was thinking more in terms of variables that are not in your model or in Michel's models, which would be the international component. Because both, if I'm thinking of Colombia and Mexico, one of the main variables that is changing, and is changing particularly in terms of the capacities of the state to security, has to do with a global market of drugs. And that has reduced enormously the capacity of the state to tackle violence. So the problem with the argument that you are presenting would seems that the Praetorian response to this kind of problems would be the solution. And well, Colombia lived that. Mexico is living in that situation right now. So I'm not sure if it's only in terms of the inequality of the conditions in the society, but these other problems. Because the money is not originated here. The money is originated from abroad. So these kind of models in which you just are looking at the domestic factors wouldn't lack that international component. I think that would be very interesting to know your thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I have a particular view on this in Colombia, which is, everyone is obsessed with everything being caused by drug dealing in Colombia. So I've discovered, over the course of my academic career, that I'm a contrarian. So if everybody's arguing something, I immediately assume it must be incorrect. So and I always, when I teach in Bogota, I always use the R.H. Moreno Duran, who was a great Colombian writer. Had this joke, it's very deep though, you have to think about it. I'm going to tell you the joke, and then you have to think about it, which is, in Colombia, politics corrupts drug dealing. So I think, if you look at Colombia's problems, they all antedate the rise of the drug economy, in the 1970s with like the marihuaneros or whatever, or then the Medellin drug cartel gets off the ground. Like, to me, that was, the Venezuelans discovered oil in the Lake Maracaibo, but the Colombians didn't discover coca, in the Sabana de Bogota. They got it, they went down to Bolivia and they brought it to Colombia, So when Rodriguez Gacha, and Pablo Escobar were building Tranquilandia, they were building this enormous estate with hundreds of thousands of hectares of coca and 3 airports to fly it to America. Who noticed? Did the government notice? No one noticed. You go to Pablo Escobar's finca, it's like 5 kilometers from a massive airbase at La Dorada, like they stood there in the conning tower watching the planes laden with coca, flying to the US, the Air Force, like, What did they do? Nothing. So for me, is Colombia selected into the drug industry? The drug industry didn't move to Colombia not because of any economic advantage, but in fact they had to do a lot of green engineering in order to get the coca. The coca in Bolivia was very high altitude, so it didn't grow well in Los Llanos. So you had to breed new strains of coca. I mean, it's a very interesting history of sort of technological innovation. So it was like green revolution in coca, to make it grow in Los Llanos. So that was, that was the weak institutions of Colombia, this kind of, the vacuum of authority in half of the country that allowed Pablo Escobar and those guys to organize, I'm sure that had all sorts of negative spillover effects. You could say it's like throwing petrol on a bonfire, But my view is still, you take the coca away, the fundamental problems in Colombia are gonna be very resilient to it. I think. And like having more money is always bad, in this kind of context, But I mean, you're right that we should break it. We should break down the data in that way. We should have done that. But that's my mental problem of like always trying to kind of put, it's not. I'm talking too much about Colombia. I apologize for that. I know we're in Mexico, but it's the place I feel I know best. So you have to be patient with me. So I think the way I say it in Bogota the way I would say it in Bogota is the problem is not the coca. The problem is the Colombians. So, but I'm being funny, but I'm being silly. But yeah, obviously, I should have a better answer to that. And we should look at it more systematically. But I do think all Colombia's problems were there before the drugs arose, and yeah.
Thank you. So we have una última pregunta. ¿Te puedes presentar antes de hacer la pregunta?
Yes, hi, I'm Maximiliano Chao Trancoso from the bachelor's degree in economics here at Colmex. And I found very interesting the analysis you draw and how you draw conclusions from the violent and non-violent context within the different regions in Colombia. And so my question is, have you considered, and if so, the role of social movements as institutions within each region, non-violent or violent?
Yeah, so I didn't show you that date. Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. I was worried that I would have too much material. So one of the things we've been looking at is exactly social movements. So there's a wonderful institution in Colombia called CINEP, which is a kind of think tank run by the Jesuits. And they have this incredible data set going back to 1975 of like every social protest in Colombia, like the location, who took part, what were the issues, what were people complaining about, and who they were complaining to, which is really fascinating. Like, were they complaining to like local people or local elites or the alcaldía or like the national government or whatever? So we've done a lot of it. If you look at the web, it's not on my webpage yet. Sorry, we have a paper, but we haven't put it on the webpage because Leopoldo found a problem with it last week. But we have a lot of data from CINEP. We got this data from CINEP. So, for example, here's an interesting transition, I think. So what you see is that a lot of the election of newcomers is actually anticipated by increases in protest. So protest seems to be social protest, civic, seems to be connected with the entry of newcomers, And also one thing that's fascinating is, since the 1991 Constitution, there's been a huge increase in social protests and social movements. And what I find fascinating, is the target of the protests has been changing, and what people have been complaining about has changed. So for example, one of the things that CINEP codes, is like, are people complaining about their rights? Like rights, that could mean many things. And one of the things about the Constitution was it introduced these rights for the first time in Colombia. And you see people have adopted that language, And I think what's interesting about that is that kind of brings a lot more people together. So one thing you see, for example, is you see a lot of much more spatial correlation amongst these protests. So it's much more likely you simultaneously have protests at the same time in lots of municipalities. So it's like that now we're not complaining about something parochial. We're complaining about something that concerns all of us, about rights. And so I think that's also a very inclusive thing. So I think I had too much to talk about already today, so I deleted all the slides on protests. But just to say, you know, I think that's very important. That's very important in Colombia. You know, think about Afro-Colombians and, you know, and this collective aspect of collective action, social mobilization in Chile. You know, that's extremely important in sort of facilitating this political inclusion. So thank you for raising that. Yeah, it's a very important topic. Yeah.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias al doctor Robinson otra vez. Qué gusto tenerlo aquí. Gracias a todos ustedes por acompañarnos el día de hoy.
Antes de retirarnos, les pediría por favor si se ponen de pie para que podamos tomar la foto del presidio y ya eso sería todo. Buenas noches y muchas gracias.